Hello friends, in this video you will see a manhwa called Winter Wolf. Part 1 to 2. There are a lot of love scenes in the story, so we put a special mark by which YouTube does not recommend this video to children. We close the hot moments in any video and try not to destroy children's psyche, as a young mom's phone may be in the hands of a child. Please put a like and subscribe if you like this video. Thank you. Let's go.
One winter afternoon, the protagonist wandered through these snowdrifts. It lasted for an hour. She tried to move her horse, but her attempts were in vain, and finally he galloped away from her. A horse was supposed to be loyal to its master. The broker was clearly exaggerating, and the girl had believed him for nothing. Irresponsible bastard, but at last she had come here, a place where the heroine could hide. By the way, they were already waiting for her there. It must be that man. Someone called out to Leishtaya, a tall and sturdy man with bright golden eyes. She wanted to introduce herself by her full name the first time they met. Leishtaya Hiraner del Armen. He already knew her, Taran Kardath. That's right, the protagonist had come to the right place. Only it was too early to be happy. The girl herself exhaled relaxed, because her long wandering had come to an end. And Taran Kardath was the only person who could offer her refuge. The man led her to a far room on the second floor. But he interrupted her musings by asking why Leishtaya was walking. For all he knew, she should have been given a horse, and it didn't look like she'd fallen off it. The girl explained that everything was going well until the animal escaped. You bet, because the horse had heard them. Wolves! The pack appeared to be too close, and that meant that Leishtaya could easily die today. She was lucky. Hadn't the girl survived because of her luck today? And 2 months ago, Leishtaya had taken a risk traveling a long way through these endless snowdrifts. History repeated itself, just like when she was forced to flee the capital. She did it well. None of those brokers were worth her trust. Taran knew the danger, but didn't bother to warn her about it. And here they were. But she wished she had chosen a larger room. Her reaction made the broker laugh, and he suggested she sleep on the couch in the hall instead. Leishtaya even closed the window to avoid being seen by anyone, but Taran slightly slid the curtain because in the pitch darkness it is impossible to see where the enemy was hiding. In any case, she wouldn't be able to escape from here. What did that mean? 3 days ago, the man had learned a very interesting story. It was quite long because first the girl had to unpack her luggage. There was a ghost living in the mansion. That's the whole truth. What other ghost? What was he talking about? But Taran didn't answer. Because he was going to prepare dinner. He quickly disappeared behind the door and left the girl alone. What kind of a broker is this anyway? A normal person would have tried to calm her guest down. But Taran made her even more worried. On top of that, he had approached her so suddenly. Leishtaya felt as if she was being played with. The food was ready. Previously, the protagonist wouldn't have even looked at such food. But after 2 months of her escape, even it seemed like a luxury. Well, she shouldn't complain, because Leishtaya had only asked for shelter. It was too much to ask for decent food from a broker. But why was that man looking at her so impatiently? Just by looking at her, it was obvious that the girl was from an aristocratic family. That was the problem. Leishtaya del Armen was the queen of the high society. A fair-haired woman whose strands were redder than all the rubies and roses. Even the commoners knew about it. Because of her appearance and fame, many people recognized and reported about her. She should have stopped being an aristocrat, except that it was easier said than done. As Prince Jade's fiancée, she never thought of joining the revolution. Besides, Leishtaya couldn't do that to her parents. Except were they doing well now? That question caught her off guard. Tragedy had struck. Why did that man provoke her? Of course, the answer he gave was that Taran was interested in the person in front of him. In any case, their relationship was only a bargain, because in a couple of days Leishtaya would be leaving this place. Had she come all the way here because the port beyond these snowy lands was the only non-freezing port? With her escape by land now blocked, the protagonist had no choice but to board a boat to travel to the Duchy of Landus, where her aunt lived. But what to do? The sea was slowly being covered with ice. This winter would be colder than the previous ones. The man thought that in 3 days even the ice-free harbor would be covered with ice. If that was the case, the girl had no time to eat. Did she really want to go right now? Of course she didn't want to delay, except her horse had galloped away, and the broker only had one left. Lystia couldn't get to the port without knowledge of the area, and he was the only one who knew the way. But if the two of them rode together, the horse wouldn't be able to keep up and would collapse from exhaustion. And to walk a road that takes 3 days on horseback would be madness. What if? Get to another inn and ask for another horse. Taryn explained that the journey there would be a day, and it would take 2 days for the return trip. That would make a total of 5 days, because getting to the port would again leave 3 days. By then she'd have to set off across the frozen sea on foot. With no way to swim away, Lystia had been through so much to get here. Why was he just now telling her this? She'd have a chance to find another horse, except that would be suicide due to the weather conditions. And then Turan would be stranded, and there were other things far worse. He had heard from a friend in the Revolutionary Army that lately the search for fugitive aristocrats had almost ceased. The party had decided to act on the slaughter. They had even hired a seasoned expert in hunting aristocrats. He is the #1 professional assassin in the entire kingdom. One day he was commanded to bring a nobleman's finger. Phantom put a ring on his ring finger, and afterward put this in a leather box. And now this brutal mercenary had set his sights on Lystia. If he really started hunting aristocrats, it was hard to even eat in this situation. Girl had finished, and now she wanted to go to her room. However, she would regret it. Turan refused to get up at night for cooking. However, their rooms were next to each other. Why the reaction? An assassin suddenly appeared. The broker would be able to help. Who would have thought that he would turn out to be such a wallflower? Nothing like this will happen at night, provided Lystia behaves herself. What's he talking about? Did he think she had intentions of seducing him? The man asked her not to overreact. He wanted to say that so the girl wouldn't wake him up. It had been so long since Turan had gotten a decent night's sleep, so he planned to do it this night. Except one could sense a dash of hypocrisy. He was of a rather sturdy build. It was obvious to the naked eye that the man had been working out a lot. If a guy like this were to protect her, Lystia would feel more confident. Otherwise, he would prove to be dangerous to her. The girl had one request. She asked for a map to study the area. If the port would freeze in 3 days, the protagonist couldn't just sit around and wait for it. Lystia got what she wanted. In a strange way, the map was stained with red stains. Was it wine or blood? The man, however, insisted on the ghost story. He was so eager to tell it. Turan was probably teasing her on purpose. But for what purpose? Strange noises were heard in the night, or howls like screaming or yelling. The noise kept the girl awake. Was there really someone here? Maybe it was the ghost that Turan had spoken of. Could it be true? But there was no one in the hallway. It was definitely not a man's screams because the timbre of the broker's voice was much lower. She asked Turan to step outside for a moment, but he didn't answer. Nothing to be done. Lystia went back to bed, but the noise could still be heard. Who was that man? And why did he keep shouting and screaming in such distress? There was definitely someone else in this house, besides the protagonist and the broker. Such strange things should be talked about in the first place. Lystia still couldn't sleep a wink. She looked incredibly tired. Except that the girl did not leave Turan without a question. Maybe there was another fugitive in the house or something. He couldn't satisfy her curiosity. After all, keeping the guest's privacy was part of his job. But why was the girl asking about it? Had Lystia really seen a ghost this night? What nonsense. Did they really exist? As it turned out, the house used to be run by an illegal substance dealer. He had lived here 100 years ago and was the most famous on the entire continent for his line of work. Every day, the man threw various parties. At one such party, he met his end. Due to this situation, the guest house became unusable, suffering a huge amount of damage. That's what Turan wanted to talk about yesterday. But where was the story interesting? Lystia still didn't believe it. She assumed it was just the wind because ghosts didn't exist. Maybe an argument would settle it. The man was betting on the cost of staying here. He asked if a ghost existed, but if there really wasn't a ghost here, he wouldn't charge the girl. Was Turan a gambler? Moreover, he himself had admitted that he had never lost once yet. But what if the ghost existed? What would the man demand then? The broker was asking for full payment of the cost of lodging, and a decent sum of money on top of that. But did Lystia really have nothing else to offer? Was she in doubt about something? As it turned out, This argument seemed suspicious to her. But the man, on the contrary, only wanted to have fun, so he offered her a bet. Well, she didn't have long to ponder. Alashtea agreed, and as soon as they left this room, their bet would take effect. And with a light handshake, the girl realized how strong Turin was. Judging by his reaction, he was glad of it. Then again, that desperate ghost was yelling in the night. Yes, he was purposely intimidating her to force more money. That despicable man, all that was left was to see for herself. But now the ceiling began to vibrate. Was something approaching? Who were those footsteps? A phantom? Well, we must prepare for this encounter. Except it was Terran. The man laughed when he saw Listea because the girl was holding a revolver. But she thought he was the intruder. But the man was just making his rounds. His guest had indeed turned out to be overly sensitive. She couldn't even sleep because of the persecution mania. Even though Listea was embarrassed, she still thought that being vigilant wasn't a bad thing. But if she seriously thought there was an invasion, she shouldn't have run out like that. She should have stayed and waited by the door, because she could have been neutralized. It was revealed that Listea was worried about Turin. Was she really scared? Did the Phantom scare her that much? Yes, it was true. In that case, she was allowed to sleep in Turin's bedroom. The man would be around until the girl fell asleep. Everyone who flirted with her had the same look in their eyes full of vile lust. But now it was different. What was this man trying to accomplish? Listea turned away, wondering if Turin would be waiting under the door, saying he had no vicious intentions and only wanted to help her sleep. The girl was pleased with her choice. Now all that was left to do was sleep. But that chilling wind was blowing out of the window, and if she accepted the broker's offer, then they could take shelter from the wind. The next day, in the afternoon, instead of trusting a man who cowardly locks his door at night, it would be better off doing a tour of the mansion. Listea observed Turin's behavior in the morning. He wasn't acting arrogant or rude, but he couldn't be called friendly either. Did he really have nothing to hide? No way. The mansion was so luxurious. What about her house? It must be abandoned too. On the third floor, the West Hallway room was full of books. One of them was lying on the floor. It was a book about medicinal herbs. The girl took it for herself. In the east corridor, Listea encountered mirrors. What could one do in a place like this? Why were they broken? Oh, and also all of them. The atmosphere was so overwhelming. So the protagonist was sure that if she stayed here a moment longer, she might go insane. And what was next? A torture room. Sure, there were aristocrats who preferred such a thing, but Listea had never understood it. It seemed stranger in Java. We had to get out of there soon. But what was it? Something was under her feet. The girl ran out running down the stairs, screaming in fear. She threw herself into the arms of the only man in the mansion and, barely speaking, said that there was someone on the third floor. To him, it sounded like nonsense. If there was someone there, it was only a ghost. However, every night, screams were heard. They definitely belonged to a person. The man made the assumption that it might have been a snowstorm. During the rounds, it was as quiet as a morgue. Turin liked complete silence and privacy, so he would definitely hear something strange. Then was it only Listea who heard those sounds? It couldn't be. The girl had escaped. All of this was more like a nightmare. Previously, Lady Armand had been told not to make too much noise if she didn't want to die. At that time, she was threatened with her life. But this man was sure that the Queen of High Society must like such a thing. Fear filled her mind. This nightmare felt like it had been going on forever. Red stains on her dress, like torn rags. Snow coming through the cracks. She called out for Turin. She begged him to help her. But the dream could not come true. Now Listea was lying in her bed. She was cold because all her clothes were damp with sweat. It seems that, while she was asleep, Turin had come to see her. Did he really see the protagonist crying in her sleep? There was no point in worrying about it. Right now, she needed to lie back down. But the memories, those horrible images couldn't leave her. The breathless body that had fallen right in front of her and the blood-stained revolver imprinted itself on her memory. It was then that the phantom began to haunt her. She ran to the Turin mansion. No one opened, but the shadow of a man confirmed that the phantom had found her after all. It was definitely a person, not a ghost. But that didn't make it any less creepy. But Lishtaya couldn't sleep in his room either because that would make her look terribly pathetic. Turin wasn't on her side, but she couldn't sleep, and the nightmare kept popping up in his head. She was told to be quiet. She was told to do as she was told. She was being toyed with. It couldn't go on like this. We have to get out of here, even if it's alone. Lishtaya approached the horse, expecting him to be nice to her. But she couldn't tame him. It would be better to walk. What if the protagonist falls off the horse? She's fearless. She decided to go to the nearest inn and borrow a horse and ride it to the harbor. Yes, it will not be easy, but if everything works out, she will be able to save money that we'll have to give to the broker. Plus, in a simple inn, Lishtaya would be able to sleep, unlike this place. But how clumsy she turned out to be. First, she fell, hitting a rock, and then she dropped the lamp. The protagonist had been shaving for a long time. Just a little longer, and she would be on the spot. But here was a surprise. In the dark thick of the forest, 2 yellow lights appeared. A wolf. The predator rushed towards the girl and started dragging her until a shot rang out. Turin, he made it just in time, but all he cared about was that the girl was trying to escape. It had taken her so long to admit that she actually needed help. It couldn't be helped. We'll have to hide from this blizzard. The couple found shelter in a cave. Fire was warm and the girl woke up. And what a sight. Her hand was on the man's strong chest, which made her want to run away. Except that if she kept twitching like that, the situation would escalate. Turin explained the whole situation and pictures from the night came into her mind. Lishtaya thanked her savior, but she was still trembling. The man offered her to drink this. But here was the surprise, of course. What other drink could warm her better? But it was effective. The broker asked why the girl ran away from the mansion. Did she have a desire to die alone? The reason was the desire to live. If she had stayed there, she would have gone crazy. It seemed that Lishtaya had actually seen a ghost. How clever of him to bring it up. She denied it, citing nightmares. She had been through a terrible experience, but the girl still managed to lie quietly in the man's arms. Amazing. On the day when all her family died, Lishtaya was forced to flee alone. The son of the head of the Revolutionary Party caught her and told her that he had some proposition for her. He was going to take her by force. That man didn't want to help her or anything. He only wanted to make a toy out of her. After a long silence, Turin spoke the dreaded words. This is how she survived. Except luck was on the side of the protagonist. Lishtaya grabbed a revolver and disposed of her assailant. That sentence made the broker laugh. He couldn't even think that the one who did this to him was her. Why didn't people know she was the perpetrator? As it turned out, it was rumored that the famous Bran met his demise from a bullet to the forehead from a hitman. But fortunately, in Listy's case, it was self-defense. Who would dare condemn her? She wouldn't have survived if she hadn't done it. It all seemed strange to her, for the man's touch was not disgusting. How frivolous, Irene suddenly seemed a little more sympathetic. He'd gone to great lengths for the contract, so he couldn't let things go wrong. The man wondered why the girl hadn't come to him. He had even left the door open. Still, Turin was less dangerous than the wolves of the snowy valley. How foolish of him. It would make her look pathetic, but that wasn't the real reason either. Truth be told, she was scared because Turin didn't care about the girl's life. All they had in common was the brokerage contract. Either the Phantom killed her or the wolves. He wouldn't care as long as it didn't involve money. That's why Lishtaya decided he wouldn't help. He was getting closer and closer. And if he only cared about money and profit, would Turin have rescued her through the blizzard from the wolves? Would he have taken her to safety, built a fire, warmed Lishtaya with his body? If he had, he would have taken everything from her and left her for certain death. Then what did he want with her? Surely she didn't want to be left here. A man would be by her side, and therefore from now on, she shouldn't have run away so recklessly anymore. He almost lost his mind when he saw the empty room. Lishtaya had promised not to make any more escapes. Maybe Turin should have helped her make sure she didn't remember such things. It was all very simple. She needed to take advantage of him. If a girl often dreamed about the same nightmarish incident, then she should replace it with another memory. That's it. Another memory? What did Turin intend to do now? If Lishtaya was against it, then she needed to say so right now, because it wasn't in his plans to be shot. Should I have pushed him away? But this man's touch felt so good, and he kept coming closer and closer. Lishtea was not disgusted by Terran and his body, which sheltered her from the cold. On the contrary, she wished he wouldn't stop. What was the reason he was doing all this? The man wanted all the terms of their contract honored. He had promised to do everything to keep her from having nightmares, to make sure she never thought of running off in the middle of the night again. But if Terran appeared in her dreams, she wouldn't want to wake up. How could he be so sure? Why so suddenly? How would the girl feel? Will she be hurt, and wouldn't she regret it? The man guessed that it would be her first time. Of course, because then she had avoided something irreparable. Fortunately, the revolver was still in her luggage. That's what he said. Why was the broker suddenly suggesting such extremes to her? It made her very uneasy. Except that she would soon cease to care about that sort of thing. Terran was covering her with compliments. His words and touches made her feel embarrassed. But why did he close her eyes? Would everything be all right? But Lishtea still couldn't relax, even though the man had taken matters into his own hands. The broker had no desire to stop. His desire was stronger. And so was hers, even if the protagonist didn't want to admit that fact. Hot breath burned her skin, and hard hands caressed her skin sticky with sweat. The first time was always like this. She was so badly tired that he had to carry Lishtea in his arms. Next time would be much easier, and she'd be able to move around on her own. So there would be a second time. The man lowered her onto the bed and promised to wake her up when it was time for dinner. But she had one request. Lishtea had asked the broker to teach her how to use a weapon. All she did that day was pull the trigger, and she wasn't sure if it would work or not. More things were happening between them that were not in the contract. What was the point of all this if nothing guaranteed her safety? Lishtea could meet the wolves again, like yesterday, or she could be threatened by something else. But everything had to have a price. What they'd done yesterday wasn't in the contract either, but the man hadn't asked her for payment. There was no need for payment if it was a mutual decision. He was mocking. Then what did Terran want as payment? Besides money. The man pulled on a satisfied grin and asked for the table to be set. He wanted her to do it well for once. But Lishtea had never done it before. It couldn't be helped. He would have to teach her how to do it for free. Her body felt so heavy, so she wanted to hurry up and change her clothes and go to bed. But the stormy night kept popping up in her mind. She wanted to hear that someone loved her. She was crazy. What love? Terran was only interested in their contract. So she too wanted to rely on a man only as part of the contract. Finally, everything was ready. He waited, but the girl didn't come down for a long time. But what was the matter? Lishtea was breathing heavily, and so the broker asked since when she had been feeling like that. It's going to be difficult. We'll have to go to the village to get the medicine. But the girl said she'd feel better if she slept for a couple days. It seems she had no idea how dangerous fever is. With this kind of fever, people usually died. If they survived, they lost their hearing or sight. Had he already encountered this? As it turned out, it was true. The man was courting her. Moreover, he was so savvy. Terran was so deeply concerned, it seemed to be really dangerous. He had managed to change his towel 3 times in such a short period of time. Why would he care about her so much? Did he really have a client who died of fever? Terran said that when he was 10 years old, a fever broke out in his homeland and he survived it. But his mother died. It's all a thing of the past now. Will Lishtea also be able to let go of the past after a while? Absolutely. And she wishes to continue living? Her whole family died because of this revolution. Did anyone die because of terrain? What a rude question. Because of the heat, the protagonist was completely out of her mind. You should have stopped talking nonsense. When the man was 14, he followed the men from the village to hunt. There the guy hit an innocent man with a bullet. It was his mistake. It was hard for him to talk about it. But he did tell that someone had set the trap wrong and a bear cub had gotten caught in it, and thus they had been targeted by the bear. She was very furious and attacked them sharply. Everyone out of fear either ran or shot blindly. They chased her off, but one man did die. He was hit by a bullet when it was fired by Terran. Then it wasn't his fault. Was that really the reason why the guy started living alone? That's right. Terran was banished from the village then. and he had to do a lot of things to survive, so loneliness became a habit for him. Suddenly he decided to cut off the dialogue referring to his guest temperature. As soon as the sun rose, the man would go in search of a cure, which would take a day. She promised not to run away. He, in turn, sighed heavily, deciding not to let the nightmares bother her anymore. Back then in the cave, he had closed her eyes that way too. When Leishtea woke up, she would have a lot to talk to him about. But who is this boy who looked so much like Terran? The girl couldn't remember the content of the dream. She missed him. How long had it been? Suddenly, the protagonist jumped up due to a strange sound. Apparently, it was an icicle. She wanted to go for a walk, despite the temperature. But what was it? 3 silhouettes were walking towards the mansion. It definitely wasn't Terran. What kind of people are they? They were talking amongst themselves about how cold they were. Their conversation mostly touched on the topic of money. Yes, and they seemed to have done something illegal that they would be punished by the gallows. Leishtea cautiously tried to eavesdrop on what the brigands were talking about. She had to hide somewhere. If she was caught, it would definitely go beyond a simple robbery. First, she had to go back to the room, put out the fireplace. But there was a problem. Leishtea was clumsy. The bandits realized that there was someone else in the house. What's more, there was the smell of food coming from the kitchen. This mansion smelled like smoldering wood. Thank goodness the brigands hadn't heard the recent sound. The men split up to look around, and the protagonist began to think of ways to escape. If she ran outside, they would notice footprints in the snow. If she went down to the first floor, she would be caught. This happened at the exact moment. Terran wasn't around, except that Leishtea was sure she would manage to survive on her own. First, she decided to return to the room. There, the protagonist began to look for her revolver. There were only 3 bullets left, 1 for each of them. It would be hard, but she had no other choice. The girl decided to hide behind the door, as Terran had advised. If the bandits came in, she could shoot from her blind spot. But fear gripped her. One of the men had already gone up to the 2nd floor. He was now in Terran's room, which was empty. There was nothing to steal here. There was no money, no luggage. Where had the man gone? The brigands made up their minds to seize him firmly first, and afterward to interrogate and finish him off. But all this time, Leishtea tried to restrain herself, but eventually she sneezed. The men realized that there was a woman in the next room. One had to stay calm. But they were so determined that they started shooting at the castle. It would be better to shoot at the hinge. Now they were trying to get through to Leishtea herself. Except, they shouldn't have been sneaking into someone else's house. It was payback time. The protagonist was sure it was Turian who had returned. She wanted to answer, but her voice. The man went inside and asked the girl to sit still, because there was a pool of blood on the threshold. But that wasn't what she cared about right now. Behind Turian's back was the last outlaw. Fortunately, everything ended well. Even though the man was stained with red liquid, she threw herself into his arms. How worried Leishtea had been. It wasn't like the broker was even injured, and the blood wasn't his either. The protagonist herself was hot. Apparently, the fever had risen again. He brought medicine, so he'll be fine. She waited for him, and Turian arrived on time. Their eyes shone with happiness, as if they couldn't be without each other. Broker came back to her alive and well. That was more than enough. But now the girl had to take her medicine before she got worse. And while she slept, Terran would clean up the mess. Leishtea wished she could help him, but he still asked her to stay in the room. There was nothing difficult about it, so the man would manage on his own. Besides, a sick man needed a good rest to recover, and so he disappeared behind the high door, leaving her alone. Leishtea clutched the bag of medicine she needed to take first, but a strange feeling never left her. The protagonist looked in the mirror and noticed that she looked like a ghost. The girl took off her blood-stained dress and, wiping her face and neck, lay in bed. Just as Terran had said, she needed a good night's sleep. How she wished the man would always stay by her side. After a while, she woke up. It was already dark, but she noticed that her clothes were gone and the red stain on the door was gone. Had he really cleaned everything so thoroughly? She needed a change of clothes because Leishtea would be bathed in blood, and now she wanted to wash herself. there was a bathroom on the first floor. Her fever had gone down, and it was much easier to move around, even feeling better. It seems that the medicines that Taryn bought were very expensive. What was the price? He had already saved her life twice. No matter how much the protagonist gave, she still wouldn't be able to pay him back. At this time, Taryn was running hot water into the bathtub. She was so attracted to his appearance, the look of a sturdy man. The broker himself noticed that since the girl was able to get down on her own, she was definitely better. She, on the other hand, referred it all to the medicine he had brought, and Leishtaya noticed the clothes he had put away. The girl suggested that he wash up first because she was going to take her clothes and wash them in the kitchen. But he stopped her. Leishtaya became flustered when the man got so close and she was wearing practically nothing, except this was the bathroom Tarine had prepared for her, so she had to go first. The girl explained that just rinsing off with water was not enough for her. Moreover, he had much more blood on him than she did. It wasn't about blood stains. Our Leishtaya had a high fever and a cough, so it was necessary for her. The man asked her to lie in warm water and wash herself so she wouldn't get sick again. Such a bath would do her good. But isn't it too big? Of course, that's why Tarine took so much water. If it is not completely filled, the water will quickly cool down, in which case the protagonist may catch a cold again. Couldn't they just take a bath together? The man played dumb and asked why. The girl, however, replied that she felt sorry to waste so much water for only one person, and the bathroom was very spacious. Was that the reason? Waste of water? Embarrassment overtook her, causing Leishtaya to even look away. Well, Taryn didn't object. How generous and compliant. What should I do? It was so embarrassing for the protagonist to stare at him like that. But would she just keep standing there holding her clothes? Maybe the girl just offered it up to keep standing and staring like this. She was denying everything, although her reaction spoke of something completely different. For some reason, the thought popped into her head that Taryn wasn't interested in her body. Only she cared about that kind of thing. The man was the first to climb into the bathroom, and Leishtaya worried that he might turn around. Had she really suggested he bathe together? He wondered if there was a need to cover himself so thoroughly. The protagonist, on the other hand, was confused because the water was clear, which meant everything would be visible. Since that was the case, why wouldn't Taryn cover himself up too? Unbelievable. He wasn't embarrassed at all. He looked as if he was dressed right now. That's what made Leishtaya so nervous, but she liked it last time. He couldn't help but notice it. Broker kept making fun of her, and it sounded so vulgar. Except the problem wasn't that it was her first time. It was that Taryn's dimensions were too big. He knew he would be though, which was why he'd said that if she got the urge, the girl could use her revolver. Probably Leishtaya didn't know exactly whether she liked it that time or not. But the man was sure of the positive, only what was the reason. If she didn't like it, the girl wouldn't be sitting here in front of him. And even in such a way, he was definitely right now. Taryn asked what she had dreamt. She'd been asleep while he'd been wandering around, hadn't she? Apparently she had been dreaming about him. Why so confident? It was true that she had dreamt about a man. Moreover, it was more than once. Leishtaya didn't remember the content of the dream, but if she denied everything, the broker wouldn't question her anymore. This time, a protagonist was going to be sincere. She wanted to trust him. She didn't mind what was in her dream, but then it was much better than in real life. Taryn wondered what his twin was doing in the dream. It was soft and gentle. He hugged her, and Leishtaya felt warm and affectionate. The man was not as rough as he had been then. Taryn asked her to continue. He was very curious. A kiss, then as now. His massive arms encircled her fragile waist. The broker focused on her. In the dream, it had started with a kiss. What came next? The man had whispered something. Words of love. Except she should have said it out loud. Otherwise, he wouldn't stop. Leishtaya remained silent. It seemed she really didn't want to admit it, but his yellow eyes made her do so. How had everything happened? It had been incredible. What had she felt from his touch? It certainly couldn't end there. The sound seduced both of them. Even though the protagonist was embarrassed, she enjoyed it. It was as if the man was just having fun with her. In the dream, he was affectionate and gentle, But dreams are nothing more than dreams. The sensations changed each time, and Taryn made her blush even more. Apparently, the man wanted to do the same thing as he did in the dream. Maybe it was time to come clean, Leistea. In her mind, the broker was whispering about his feelings, but if she said it, it would seem as if the protagonist craved his love. Was she really scared? Their bodies made contact and the pain felt different. Slow movements would let her get used to it, though Taryn didn't stop. This was so different. It was getting more assertive, but Leistea was enjoying it. He was right after all. It would only get better from here. Now it wasn't enough for Leistea. It felt as if they had become one with him. Maybe they should try something new. Taryn took the initiative. She, on the other hand, loved watching the look on his face, which was focused entirely on her. The protagonist wished he would lose his head, but so far it was only happening to her. Now then, Leistea was sure it was better than sleep. She was left without strength, and the man noticed a bruise on her elbow. That's because the girl had bumped the curb a little then. So he was lying when he said he wouldn't hurt her. It was okay because the protagonist wasn't a sister to the end either. It was actually different in her dream. The man was telling her how he felt. Taryn from her dream said that he loved her. What was that look on his face? Was he nervous? Did Leistea really want the broker to love her? Unless the man makes some kind of deal with her. Then what did she want? That they could put in their current contract? As expected, Taryn only wanted a contracted relationship. So the protagonist replied that she no longer wished for nightmares. Today had not been a pleasant day, but now Leistea woke up in the arms of the broker. What was he doing here? As it turned out, girl lost consciousness during the process and brought her here and then fell asleep next to her. That was it. Honey was cold himself, but sleeping together was warm and cozy. Besides, they can thus save firewood. What a trickster. Only now the protagonist was confused by a slightly different fact. The man asked her to relax because now she was like a log, not a living person. Was Leistea really that hard? Everything was strange to her. Like the peculiarity of men, especially in the mornings, Taryn was sorry to miss the opportunity, but had the protagonist enjoyed last night? The girl had turned as red as a tomato. It wasn't fair to take advantage of that look. Or was it something she didn't feel like doing right now? In the meantime, Leistea, as Tarini had noticed, had become even more seductive. As praise, he was going to teach her something new. The man asked her to lean against the table and bend at the waist. It was a little awkward. What was he going to do? Yeah, this was something the poor girl clearly hadn't expected. Her body and tongue were saying very different things, but Leistea was clearly melting from Taryn's touch. And even that didn't make her fall asleep. The man brought hot water so she could wash her face, and the day passed unnoticed. But what was with his speech? The profanity was coming out of his mouth? You rascal. Leistea stopped him, because there was a heavy snowstorm outside and she was afraid. She would not be able to sleep because of the blizzard, so she asked him to talk to her until she fell asleep. Of course he agreed. The couple couldn't go out anywhere because of the cold, and the blizzard grew more and more fierce. For days on end, they enjoyed each other, making excuses for the weather and the cold. And they had endless excuses for it. Leistea had even gotten used to falling asleep together, and she knew that in the morning, when she first opened her eyes, Taryn would be by her side. She wanted it to last forever, and even this time he woke up before her. Today they would just rest, even though the man had said the same thing yesterday. It had already been a week since they had taken a bath together. Since that day, they hadn't left each other's side. The week had flown by. In other words, they had a whole bunch of excuses to do it all over again. Except that ever since the protagonist started sleeping with Turin, her nightmares had stopped. Now the girl was sure that there were no ghosts in the mansion at all. As it turned out, the broker was going to leave tomorrow for about 24 hours to get them a horse. The blizzard was just now subsiding, the snowfall having stopped as late as last night. It was the perfect time. Even if it's only for a day, but the departure should be prepared very carefully. So it would be best if everyone slept in their own homes tonight. But what if Leistea heard voices again if she was alone? Can't they just sleep next to each other? that would be somewhat difficult for him. When the protagonist was around him, he had a hard time controlling himself. Right now, she was perfectly fine, which meant there was nothing to worry about. Memories of her first night in that mansion suddenly resurfaced. She was scared and anxious, but now she didn't think a contracted relationship was such a terrible idea. She needed Taryn. While outside, Lashtea practiced firing her weapon. She practiced so hard, but there wasn't much time left. Did the girl regret spending so much time with the broker instead of practicing her skills? No, she would never regret it. The man was going to help her by making the target easier first. It was hard for her to focus on the target because of the distraction of the trees in the background. But this way, it would be much better. In her head, the protagonist was going over in her head what it took to get into the right position that would minimize recoil, and how to hold the muzzle at the right angle. Shoulders were not to be forgotten. And then it was necessary to focus on the target. Keeping her eyes on it, hold her breath and fire. She did it. Except the target was different. I think someone had fallen. Lashtea noticed that there were no visible wounds, so it was definitely not because of her shot. Was he just passing by? Or was it an outlaw? We had to see if he had a weapon on him before the stranger regained consciousness. Taryn ordered her to step back. Hadn't he said that privacy was paramount to him? Shouldn't he have done that? What if this guy turned out to be a mere civilian? Lashtea had so naively trusted a complete stranger simply because he didn't look like an outlaw. Had she forgotten what happened last time? What made her think the guy wasn't a threat to them? Even if he wasn't so innocent, one shouldn't take a life so recklessly, but it wasn't up to her to decide. Taryn had made his choice, except she couldn't do that. The stranger coughed and asked them to stop swearing. The girl jumped up and rushed over to him, begging him not to faint back. Taryn exhaled. It was clear from his eyes that Lashtea had ruined everything. In any case, it was necessary to carry the blonde to the manor. Broker offered to help her. If that man didn't wake up, what would the protagonist do? No, there's no way. He wouldn't take another man's life. The blonde man himself didn't know how to thank them. The man owed them a debt of gratitude. Apparently, he hadn't heard their conversation. It was such a relief. His name was Grey Hofrander, though asked to be addressed as he pleased. Taryn didn't let his guest give his real name. Liz was how he introduced her. Moreover, the man called her his wife. And the Or himself was Karen Cardath, who practiced the hunting trade. Grey glowed and nodded his head cheerfully. He had an odd way of speaking. Yes, that the man apologized for was his working habit. As it turned out, their guest was a detective. As it turned out, this profession existed not only in novels, but also vocally. But Taryn remained calm, so he simply replied that they were on vacation. The couple was on their way to the port, but were stuck here due to a heavy snowstorm. But where was Mr. Hofrander's destination? The man explained that he had urgent business in the capital. He didn't want to lose his job, so he tried to rush as fast as he could so that he wouldn't stop anywhere overnight. He began to feel dizzy, and then Grey heard a shot and fell off his horse. If it hadn't been for those two, something bad might have happened to him. The man was clearly exaggerating, but Taryn said naively that it was a good thing since they had discovered him in time. But it was right that Mr. Grey would soon be leaving them. As it turned out, yes, as soon as Harmony returns. That's the name of his horse. Oh, she's a sweet little thing, but terribly cowardly, and immediately galloped away when she heard the shot. The man was sure that the animal was wandering around somewhere nearby, so the horse would be back as soon as he called for it. The broker added that since the blizzard was over, there should be no problem. But Mr. Grey waited for the right opportunity. If luck was on his side, he could leave as early as tomorrow. Otherwise, he might have to stay here. Of course, that wouldn't please the married couple. Was Lashtea angry? Because Taryn had lied a little. He could have told a lot of different things. For example, that they were related. But wouldn't that be even more suspicious? They didn't look anything alike. If you think about it, these two have been acting like newlyweds for the past week. The only thing missing was a child to complete the picture. And anyway, was Lashtea sure she had a right to be angry with him? Because of her impulsiveness, everything had gone downhill. Taryn had no idea how to fix things now. However, he was the one who had changed the target's position, so she wasn't the only one to blame. The man had offered the best solution to the problem, but the protagonist had ruined everything. To straighten him out was the best solution. Except how could he be so careless about it? Turin didn't understand how she could so blindly trust a total stranger. She who had escaped, and was a wanted man, there was a direct threat to her life, yet the girl was so impulsively making the trek. Leishtea hoped everything would be alright as long as Turin was around. So be it, but strangers couldn't be allowed to stay here. The protagonist ended up apologizing for over-relying on him. The broker exhaled heavily and mumbled that he wouldn't go to fetch the horse tomorrow because he wouldn't let her be alone with this gentleman. She insisted otherwise, but the decision was not hers to make. Everything went downhill the moment Leishtea approached this man. He spoke as if he really was her husband. Turin had no right to treat her like that, but now her entire life was in his hands. The broker had saved her repeatedly, keeping her out of danger. Of course, the girl was more than grateful to him for that. However, since she owed him so much, what was to be done? How will the protagonist have to repay her debt to her savior? It was simple, because Turin had a life too, so how was she supposed to save his life? She didn't. From now on, the man would pay close attention to the little things. If she continued to act like this, his patience would run out, and he would leave her. It was as if Leishtea was back in the crosshairs of his gun, just as she had been then. Turin dominated this relationship, not her, so she, being the weaker party, should obey. In that case, the man was free to do as he saw fit. Now she was making huge concessions, believing that everything would have to go back to normal just like that. But the man was still not satisfied. As he had promised, the girl would be able to rest in the morning. Turin disappeared behind the heavy door, slamming it defiantly, and Leishtea collapsed onto the bed. Would everything be the same as before? The next day, Mr. Gray said hello to Mrs. Cardath. Both men were sitting at the table, eating breakfast. But when Leishtea took a seat next to Turin, he jumped up abruptly and said that he was about to bring breakfast for Liz. The detective noticed that Mr. Cardath was in a bad mood today. The protagonist confirmed his words and added that this happens sometimes. But after all, they were not a couple. How should she speak so as not to arouse suspicion? Turin came back and addressed his wife, saying that she should do something about her habit of going to bed late because she was always late for breakfast, or even skipped it. The main character apologized, saying that she couldn't get to sleep, so she was always tossing and turning. Again? Mr. Grace apologized for interfering, and added that Mrs. Cardath could have breakfast with him because he ate slowly. At this point, Turin decided to leave them, and the detective interjected about when they were going to the northern port. If so, they must have been talking about the port of Sylvains. Was there anything of note there? Leishtea assumed it was the frozen sea. But how did he know about it? The port of Sylvains was known for being ice-free. Mr. Grace wanted to ask the same thing. How did the girl know that the port was covered with ice? Oh no. It was necessary to stay calm. If the protagonist panicked, it would raise even more questions for the detective. She said that they were just about to visit it. They had heard about it from their acquaintances. They told the couple that now it is possible to observe a unique phenomenon, the glaciated sea. Mr. Grace laughed and pretended that everything became clear to him. The protagonist, on the other hand, thought that most likely he would now wonder who their acquaintances were, except that the man had come from there himself. He was in the port for about 2 months for work, just on his way to the capital to give all the reports, so that's how he knew that the sea was frozen. Leishtea wondered if it was because of the investigation. In the novels she read, investigations usually took a few days. However, the reality was more severe. And the incident mostly always happened where there was more congestion. But only after lethal proceedings and questioning could the detective find any leads. And it all happened in places similar to this. It was interesting, but it didn't pay much, so Mr. Grace took other cases. The man suggested she take a walk around the mansion after breakfast, and she agreed, if only for a little while. Mr. Hofrander was not as tall as Turin, but still quite statuesque. and his looks just like some heir to an aristocratic family. In the palace, the protagonist often saw others like him. The detective asked how long they had been married. He also assumed that Mr. Cardath had been upset about something this morning, but they still had a good relationship. Leishtier replied that they had gotten married about a year ago, so the man assumed they were going on an anniversary trip. Something like that. The mere thought of the girl having to adjust to Terran's fiction made her head hurt. He was gentler than he appeared at first glance. He was an excellent cook, and he had prepared the room for Mr. Grace surprisingly quickly. Even if Terran had said he was a cook and not a hunter, he would have believed it too. Or he could have been a butler for some rich family. Had he really thought that? Of course he did. After all, the detective had not had a chance to verify that Terran was an excellent hunter. It was only a guess, but Mr. Cardiff must have made a good living out of it. They could even afford to travel. And yes, his wife could relax and enjoy a pastime like reading novels. Now Leishtier was worried that she had mentioned them at all. She was lucky to have met such a reliable man. He paid a lot of attention to her and let her read books. And Terran rarely frowned as he did today, except that yesterday they hadn't shared a bed but slept separately. How did he know that? The master asked to be understood correctly because he was not peeping at them. In the morning the man left the room, briefly to call Harmony, but what caught his eye was that there was a light glowing in the two rooms, probably the source of which was the fireplace. That's how the detective found out that they hadn't slept together. Could it be called anything other than peeping? Now that she had mentioned it, the man apologized for his rudeness. It would be a problem if he kept it up. They'd had a little fight about money yesterday, which was why they'd saved apart. The detective agreed that it was a delicate matter. Moreover, they had only one horse in the stables, but he could lend them Harmony, so the man hoped that they would somehow work out their differences. Had he managed to go there yet, too? What a fox! They finally reached the end of the hallway. Why did the detective of all people wander in here? And if he finds out their real identities, they're finished. There were so many rooms in the mansion, so Mr. Grace was curious if Miss Cardath was everywhere. The answer was no. The building was old and abandoned, and so she was scared to wander around here alone, and the corridor seemed ominous. Leishtier decided to show her neutral attitude so as not to fuel his interest in them. The man knew who the manor used to belong to, and so he assumed there was something busy and intriguing going on in every room. It was necessary to change the subject at once. The girl asked about his horse. The detective replied that Harmony would be back within a few days, but he couldn't say for sure. Maybe the animal would want to walk in the wild longer. For the first time in a long time, she tasted freedom. But the horse wouldn't be able to wander for too long, and when the blizzard started up again, she'd be back. Leishtier had been stuck here because of that unfortunate blizzard. She couldn't believe that now that the blizzard had subsided, she wanted it bad. It took 287 steps to get around the first floor corridor. The length of the corridor on the first and second floors was exactly that long. The detective explained that if you looked at the building from the outside, you could see that the floors were exactly the same size. He had hoped to find a secret room. Why would he do that? Usually old mysterious estates had secret rooms, so the man thought that there were some here too. Moreover, since this place used to be the lair of such a horrible criminal who engaged in illegal activities, there should definitely be secret passages here. Did Mr. Grace think of such a thing purely out of curiosity? Except he had a purpose of sorts. There was something her husband might know, since he was a hunter. There used to be cases where drugs that were now only used on animals were used on humans too. For fun or something. Did it really happen in this mansion? That's right. This place used to be extremely famous, but it was looted after the previous owner passed away. That's when all the forbidden substances in huge quantities were stolen. It was also curious that there was still one substance that had never been discovered. It was distributed only to the most reckless aristocrats. Could it be used to induce hallucinations? No. Such substances were also dangerous and fatal, but the detective was talking about something more dangerous. But what could be more dangerous than lethal? Mr. Grace was sure she had a hunch about that. But the girl's mind simply refused to comprehend this kind of thing. The drug that people had never been able to discover even after 100 years of searching was the truth serum. It completely sucked all the energy out of the body and destroyed the boundaries of the human mind. According to the archives, the most powerful truth serum was created within the walls of this estate. So a person couldn't lie under its influence. It still didn't seem worse than death to her. Perhaps she hadn't quite gotten the idea. The drug could reveal private information. But then it was a little disconcerting. What thoughts crossed her mind when she was alone with Mr. Cardath? How could he even ask such a thing? If she really had been forced to talk about such a thing, Leishtaya would have preferred death. Naturally, it used to be a kind of fun. Truth serum was incredibly popular among aristocrats. But why was the detective looking for it? It was his job and it made money. He was sure there would be other buyers for the drug. It was because of the resolution that the prison was now filled with prisoners who were regularly tortured. There was no way this drug could be used on them. But why was he sharing such valuable information? She was his savior. The detective hoped that the quarrel between the two men would end soon, because Taran was not the type to flaunt his emotions. Such people were extremely careful about their survival. They were very good at discerning what belonged to them and what didn't. Mr. Cardath was probably just used to hiding his feelings. She didn't even think about it. Moreover, Leishtaya had to give this man what he wanted most. And what did he want? The question caught Leishtaya by surprise. The girl stopped moving and mentally began to pick up the options of what her fictitious husband wanted. Leishtaya didn't run away or talk when she felt bad or afraid of something. And she also cooked dinner. The protagonist was making this response for his help and care for her, but Taran had never once shared his desires for nothing. That thought provoked a look of sadness to appear on her face. Now she genuinely wanted to know what the man was hiding in the depths of his heart. Mrs. Cardath shared her opinion with Mr. Hofrander regarding the fact that he must have been a master in love affairs and even gave her advice. The man grinned contentedly from ear to ear and explained that it had worked out somehow on its own, because he was interested in other people's romantic problems. The detective ended their dialogue and said goodbye. Disappearing out the door, Amistaya was immersed in her own thoughts for a while. As it turned out, it was pointless for her to win that bet about the ghost, and she didn't need the forbidden drug either. After all, her true desire was to get closer to Taran, and that was only possible if she gave him what he really wanted. But all the heroine had was a meager savings for a temporary shelter and the ring she received after her engagement to the prince. Everything else was her clothes and useless junk. Nothing special. Will he need any of these? Would this work? After a while, Leishtaya was already wandering through the dark corridors, clutching the object to her chest. Mentally, the girl calmed herself because now Mr. Hofrander was outside to call harmony. It meant that the girl would be able to talk to Taran quietly and without any extra ears. She knocked on his door and asked if she could come in. The man opened the door and inquired what the matter was. Leishtaya stared at him and told him about the absence of the detective, but he asked again why she had come to see him. To tell me something, the girl asked to come inside. Not for long at all, and when she took his hand, the man sighed heavily, as if he couldn't resist her request and let her come in. Apparently, he was cleaning his gun. Her hunch was true since it was his daily routine. Taran gave her a wry look and asked her to hurry. The girl came to apologize for what she said yesterday, so she admits that the man was right. Negative words were heard from her lips. Leishtaya did not admit he was right. Laying her heart on her hand, the heroine apologized for her attitude. She didn't know much about him. They lived completely differently, but the girl pressed him, imposing her own principles. At those words, Taran seemed to lose his temper. His eyes reminded him of the nature of a predator. Had Leishtaya realized something about him? He wondered what his principles she could tell him about him. The first was impatience with the slightest risk. If the risk increased, the man did not hesitate to eliminate it by any means, even if it meant murder. And if the plan of action he'd drawn up went awry, Taran would do his best to get things back to the way they were. He was angry at her yesterday because he was that kind of person. Leishtaya may have been guilty of thwarting his plan, but he could do nothing to her because the girl is paying him a debt. It would now be more difficult for him to eliminate the threat of Mr. Hofrander. Tyrion, on the other hand, hummed and explained that it wasn't hard to get rid of this detective even now. But there was still time because the man only intended to observe him, and if Leishtea was going to make her assumptions, she should do it properly. She didn't understand why Mr. Cardiff was saying it with a smile. He didn't share the same values as the heroine. She should have recognized that. And so Leishtea wanted to make sure he was angry about it. Tyrion didn't give a definite answer, but he wondered what his called wife would do. Would she want the man to reconsider his values because she now understood them? The protagonist only wanted to apologize to him because yesterday Leishtea couldn't convince herself to do the right thing because of this misunderstanding. And now she would insist on not killing people so easily. This phrase seemed to bewitch him. The girl continued to speak. When a similar situation arose again in the future, she asked him not to think of murder as the first possible solution. Tyrion mumbled that there were situations that called for bloodshed. From her point of view, yesterday's circumstances were different. The man explained that she did not fully understand what his job was. All she knew was that he was a broker, and that was already considered dangerous. Leishtea volunteered to help so that he would no longer have the need to kill. And how would she do that? Now the heroine was convinced that she might not have understood everything. Perhaps it was not at all what he desired, but it was worth a try. Leishtea offered to leave this place together. What she could offer him was herself. Tyrion watched her silently until he repeated her question. Leishtea really did want to hide with him in the Duchy of Landis, but to him it seemed like a joke for some reason. The man told her to think of something better to convince him. But she went on. Her savings would be enough. The heroine still had money set aside for her escape in Prince Jade's engagement ring. With its sale, they could live without needing it until they crossed the border. Tyrion was perplexed, but Leishtea insisted that they live together. So he replied that he wasn't dating, but the girl didn't even suggest being together. She only meant living together. Did the protagonist only go this far because she hated the fact that Tyrion was capable of murder? His eyebrows drew together, giving a stern expression. Yesterday, when he had said he would kill Mr. Hofrander as if it were some trifle, but she had been stunned with horror, feeling betrayed. Leishtea was confused and worried. This led him to think that the girl was afraid of being killed, by him one day. But that turned out not to be true. She felt so strange about the words he had said, but at the same time, she did not feel disgusted or hate him. And then Leishtea confessed that she seemed to have fallen in love with him. The protagonist said it to convince him, but at the same time she was convinced of her own feelings. She needed him no matter who Tyrion was. Her soft hand reached for his cheek, to which the boy shifted a surprised look, but he pulled it away. The man explained that this was why they had made the contract. It was the only way they could give each other what they wanted. For her, there was no need for that now because Leishtea just wanted to be near him. Beyond that, she didn't need anything else. The man closed his eyes and nodded his head, explaining that they needed to clear the air. He definitely didn't want to get into this. Tyrion would never allow her to be near him. He turned his back on her and strode away, saying that at the end of the next 10 days they would. Leishtea interrupted him and announced that in that case, she would run no more. If he was uncomfortable with the thought of running away illegally, they could run away and live in a remote mountain village on that money. For now, the girl didn't know what was next for her, but at least he would be able to leave his job as a broker. Why? Why did Leishtea want to ruin her own life? And why would she go so far just to be near Tyrion? Her hand reflexively reached for her heart and a blush appeared on her face. She loved him. That's why the protagonist would do anything to get what she wanted. It wasn't a contract anymore, and she wasn't asking for payment. All she wanted to hear was an answer. Tyrion cut off that Leishtea was lying. She was scared, and he had noticed it when he had held the gun yesterday. Moreover, fear had followed her since their first meeting. The man played with her hair while saying that the heroine was getting nervous when she looked at him. He knew she was anxious from something she couldn't realize herself. And he even liked it. That's why they'd gotten this far. She just needed someone to protect her. It was ridiculous to her because Leishtea couldn't be mistaken about her own feelings. Tyrion did not just have them from her, but hadn't she herself said she would do anything he wished? In that case, The man wished that Leishtaya did not love him. That was all he would wish of her. But first, since they had a contract, the broker would give her what she wanted. A husband, strong hands reached for the light-colored shirt and began to pull it down. He forgave her to stop interfering with his plans. Turin laid the girl on the bed, taking up his clothes afterward. Leishtaya, on the other hand, began to look around the room, thinking that the wife of a real hunter must have observed such a sight every night. He noticed this and asked what she was thinking about. In her mind, she was thinking about what to do next. This man was in love with her, but had he ever felt love? Turin told her to think of it as a game. For this night, he was going to be whatever she wanted him to be. So what did Leishtaya wish for? What was happening between them didn't make any sense. The broker decided to play this role alone, and the protagonist could behave as usual. Today, Karen Cardath will treat her as his wife, Liz. She begged him not to be gentle because she liked it when he behaved normally. He enjoyed playing with her body, which shuddered at his touch. Now Leishtaya liked that Turin was playing the role of her husband. But still, the thought lingered in her mind that only the woman he truly loved could receive such kisses. But then why were there tears in her eyes? Broker kept making her blush, but she dodged, which only turned him on more. Leishtaya was embarrassed and different feelings came up for her. But Turin liked touching her the most. He couldn't help himself when Liz was so sweet. It seemed the man was serious about playing the married couple. He showered her soft body with kisses and was curious about her feelings, but the protagonist begged him to stop. Turin wasn't listening to her. On the contrary, he was making sure she didn't even have the strength to say a word. Tonight the man would do whatever she wanted. His brazen tongue was not only lashing out at her, but caressing her body, making Leishtaya shiver. Words flew out of his mouth, according to which he could do nothing about. He loved the way she reacted to his touch. The first thing that came to his mind when Turin saw her naked body was the desire to possess it. But now that he thought about it, he began to believe the thought of it appealed to her much more. Of course, the protagonist was so eager to see what the man would do this time, and it was so unusual and awkward. Turin, on the other hand, asked her why Liz was acting like they were newlyweds and this was their first wedding night. He wanted to try something new, though Leishtaya didn't mind. How could she not fall in love with him? When he spent every night with her so passionately, how could a girl not assume that Turin loved her? Her heart whimpered as the protagonist played the role of his hotly loved wife for one night. But she won't hear back from him on her confession. A man had never before embraced her as long as he did now. She cast a sweet glance at him and wondered if he was puzzled about something. Turin, on the other hand, asked her to stop being so honest. Leishtaya knew that he liked honesty and that he hated lies. That was exactly why the broker was saying that. And then his gaze became fiercer, as if he was opposing her. Waking up the next morning, the protagonist lay next to his body. She still didn't understand how he could, having rejected her confession, now hold her so tenderly in his arms. Leishtaya turned and called out to him. Turin usually woke up before she did, but he seemed to be having a strange dream right now. It wasn't as if the man was sick. Pulling on her clothes, she headed for the door, seeing it as a chance. When he woke up and saw her red curls, a wide smile appeared on his face. Leishtaya was making tomato stew according to the recipe Turin had given her last time. Even as she spoke, the man still found something to pick on. The girl didn't think the order of preparation was that important, though the man could feel the dark energy from her cooking. He explained that the flavor, texture, and appearance would be different in the end, but throwing it away was a bad idea because they could feed it to the detective. Turin really couldn't stand the man. Mr. Hofrander was a very lucky man to be here. Broker, on the other hand, didn't understand why she enjoyed contrasting with him so much, even if she risked revealing her true identity to him. The protagonist was concerned about this, but his concerns were on a completely different level, so why was he being so negative towards his guest? Gray had been quite friendly during their conversation yesterday. Turin cut off that to him. The Lord was no different than the wolf they had met before, the one the man had shot then. His gaze dulled, but he continued to drill Leishtaya with it. Both one and the other were just a part of the larger cycle of life. and both could hurt her in ways that went against his plans. Of course, the contract mattered to him. Taran felt the need to change the subject, so he asked why the woman had taken over the cooking. Did she want to look more convincing as a wife? Leishtea gave a negative answer and referred to her desire to cook something for Taran. He had taught her how to shoot, so the heroine wanted to repay him, though she had no practice in cooking. The man took the knife away and decided she would learn faster if she watched it being done correctly. Mentally, the girl marveled that the broker was really good at everything. The only time his confidence in his own affairs had been shaken was during the appearance of the detective she had rescued. Taran only worried when something spoiled his plans. Suddenly, he asked her to taste the sauce. The girl exclaimed that it tasted so much better. Her eyes shone with delight. Judging by the reaction of his facial expression, the broker was pleased. He did insist that Leishtea follow the recipe next time, after all, though it sounded easier than it actually was. Suddenly, the protagonist noticed that Hofrander had not yet come to the dining room, even though it was already lunchtime. It was a good thing because they wouldn't have to pretend when he wasn't around. And rightly so, for they would finally be able to eat alone in peace. A slight smile graced her pretty face. The day flew by in the middle of cooking. The main character walked around the mansion until she saw Mr. Hofrander. It was their first meeting today. The man was making his rounds on the 3rd floor, but it was much more interesting than expected. It was on the 3rd floor that the most interesting things were located. But Leishtea was getting nervous because Mr. Gray might see something he shouldn't. He strained a smile and replied that there was a lot of fascinating stuff there. Something the detective was even considering taking for himself. Suddenly his expression changed. Hofrander became serious and asked if his interlocutor had gone up to the 3rd floor. She had, but she had only seen a couple of rooms. The blue of his eyes was mesmerizing. The man wondered if Leishtea had seen anything unusual. But to her, all the rooms seemed strange. His question was not worded correctly. Did something strange happen to the main character while she was there? The girl thought for a second before a memory popped into her mind, turning her in red-handed. She became nervous and tried to convince the detective that she was just sick. Must have been mistaken. Leishtea took a step back, explaining that nothing much had happened, except that the look on her face said otherwise. The master kept pushing her until her foot stumbled. The girl began to fall downward. There was a look of horror on both their faces, but luckily the detective caught her in time. He quickly began to examine her while she held her head. She was not allowed to get abruptly to her feet now. Leishtea shared that her head was spinning, so Mr. Hofrander decided to take her under her shoulder, and that's what Mr. Cardath saw. The detective explained that his wife had suddenly stumbled and fallen, but his stern look said that Taran was not in the mood for dialogue. The man looked at his wife and asked her what had happened. She confirmed Mr. Gray's words. The host joked that they were having such a fun conversation that she couldn't even keep track of her own feet, losing control. The thought flashed through the girl's mind that the broker was going to take advantage of this situation so that there would be an excuse to drive the detective out of the estate. Hofrander himself said that Taran misunderstood everything because he had no evil intentions. Only the hero didn't want to believe it. He pushed the man away and lifted his wife into his arms. Mr. Cardath mumbled that even though they were not the owners of this house, it would be in the detective's best interest to leave it. He would only regard him as a man until tomorrow, and even Liz could not resist him. The situation made the detective laugh, for which he apologized. Taran stared at him as if waiting for some kind of trick. It's over. Mr. Hofrander really wanted to save Mrs. Cardath, but if her husband was telling him to leave, he had no right to object. Now it did not seem that the man had in mind saving her from falling down the stairs. The detective announced that he would be leaving at noon tomorrow. He realized that his request was rather shameless, but he wanted the lady to see him off. The man will call his horse all night long, so nothing terrible will happen. The dialogue between the detective and Leishtea, the broker decided to interrupt. When they were far enough away, the girl asked to be put on her feet, but Taran ignored her request and sat her down on the bed, asking her to remove her clothes. He wanted to make sure the girl was unharmed. Except that Leishtea couldn't let Hofrander just leave, because the man would immediately be in danger. He had no horse or other belongings. But Turin only gave her an angry look and decided that he would make the final decision. He tried again to get her to undress. The protagonist didn't respond to this phrase, but asked if it was necessary to act out this scene, just to drive the detective away. They weren't even a married couple. The man explained that he had been playing this role since Mr. Hofrander came in. This was the climax of their play, and now it was time to finish it. Except that Leishtea was not an actress in the play. She was not a piece on a chessboard that was at his beck and call. Cardath understood this perfectly well, and so the girl loved him. So he decided to outplay her. Turin fell to his knees and begged that the protagonist take off her clothes. If she hurt herself anywhere, his heart would ache. His left hand gently stroked the girl's leg, making her blush. He forced her to remember that night. Leishtea trembled, but still demanded that he stop these lies, because he didn't feel the least bit sorry for her. He didn't care if she died or lived. Even though Turin tried to kill an innocent man for interfering with his plans. But nevertheless, the protagonist loved him. The man didn't even deny that he was such a cruel person. Still, she couldn't resist his request. She wanted to do something very unpredictable, deviating from Turin's plan. Why? To make the consequences irreversible for him in the first place. She left the room, walking over to his weapon, which seemed to be waiting for her. By noon, Harmony was back, and Leishtea pondered what might have happened if she hadn't tripped falling down the stairs. Had the girl then told Mr. Hofrander everything, or asked him to investigate the ghost of the mansion as soon as she knew he was a detective? Suddenly Turin is interrupted by the flow of her thoughts appearing from behind her. The game of spouses would also stop as soon as Gray left. The man mumbled his alarm at the sudden disappearance of the gun. What could he possibly think? When he reached for it, Leishtea hid the gun behind her back. Nothing of the sort had happened. But now that the horse was back, the girl could go back to practicing shooting. She needed to speed up with this, for it wouldn't be long before winter would be over. She was doing so well that Turin even asked her to save the bullets. He allowed 10 more shots, after which the practice would be over. In his opinion, the heroine was very talented, because each time the percentage of hits on the target was higher and higher. She even offered to become a hunter, so that Leishtea could give up the port and earn money to live that way. But Cardath didn't see it that way. She might be a good shot, but that didn't mean she could kill with a gun. The protagonist pondered the answer. What if the need did arise? But that would only happen when the wolf was already approaching her with its fangs. She was infuriated by those words, but motivated. She had hit the target. The bottle was not empty, which surprised Turin. Nobody was going to drink the drink anyway. It was enough for today, so tomorrow the broker was going to find empty bottles. As it turned out, the man was purposely saving them to drink when it was all over. And of course, Leishtea was not in his plans. But Turin said that if it was her will, he would keep her company. Their dialogue was interrupted by the detective. He said he would set out slowly, for the weather was not too bad. In her mind, the heroine told herself that they could have had a fruitful union if they had met under different circumstances. Leishtea felt guilty about the incident. Turin joined in the conversation, adding that the detective had done the right thing. He owed much to Mr. Cardath and would never forget his meals. In the girl's eyes, he was so different from Turin. Mr. Hofrander was to return to the capital as soon as possible, and his stay here had put him out of schedule, even though he had made the most of his time. The girl wished him a good journey, figuring his client was already waiting. Fortunately, he was busy with other things these days, so he didn't have time to worry about the detective's return. Her sad look saw off her new acquaintance, but she still decided to stop him. As it turned out, the protagonist wanted to give him something. Leishtea found a book in the mansion. It described many herbs, so the item would be more useful to him than to her, and indeed it was a very valuable gift. The heroine thought it would be unmanly to let him go empty-handed. By the way, he had something for her too. The man held out a beautiful snow globe he'd bought at the souvenir shop in the harbor. The object rolls back and forth if the surface is even slightly uneven. The detective explained that there was no need to find a specific place for him, so he could just be left in a state of rest, but Leshtea didn't quite understand him. The third floor also measured 287 paces. The man thought it would be different from the first and second, but he was wrong. He didn't have the courage to step further and find the truth serum. But she would surely do it. And her real name came out of his mouth, which made her body petrify. How did he know what her name was? Mr. Hofrander advised her not to waste time in denial, because he had plenty of reasons to affirm who she was. Her gaze tensed and her mouth didn't utter a word. The protagonist seemed to have forgotten that her guest was a detective. The way she ate, drank, her manner of speech, it all literally screamed her true origin. The girl wondered what he would do. Would Mr. Gray inform the Revolutionary Party of her whereabouts, pressing charges? Except that if it had been a week ago, he would have done so. But his contract had expired, so all that was left was to hand over the report. For the past 2 months, the man had been tracking nobles who were smuggled out of the port. He's made a lot of money catching nobles. It was a shocking thought to her. But Mr. Hofrander reassured her that he would not blame the man to whom he owed his life. Right now, the protagonist has nothing to worry about given that she's managed to survive so far. That must be a sign of hope for her, except that mentally Leshtea denied it, because if the sea hadn't frozen over, he would have already busted her for trying to sail away illegally. Whether it was hope or something else, it was as if the universe was mocking her. But the detective had a case to finish, so he hoped that Leshtea would survive. As the man went on his way, she silently picked up the snow globe. At that moment, Turin was just approaching, interested in what they had been talking about for so long. The protagonist did not tell him all the details, but only mentioned that she had given Mr. Hofrander the find she had discovered in the mansion. It was a tattered book on medicinal herbs. Turin thought about something, but remained silent. It seemed to him that the horse would never come back. If Leshtea hadn't practiced shooting then, that animal would be theirs. In his opinion, the gun was equal in any hands. The shooter was not important, because the main thing was to hit the target. The protagonist didn't like the direction in which their conversation was unfolding, because the man literally hinted that the girl would blunder. That was wrong though. The difference was that he would shoot and she wouldn't. As the man had said, Leshtea wouldn't be able to kill the poor innocent wolf because all this time she'd been living in a world where it wasn't required. At that phrase, the protagonist clenched her weapon harder, but pointed it sharply to the side. Turin said she had done the right thing. That was the way to aim if the target was stationary. But the girl didn't stop there. She pulled the trigger, but the man didn't let her hit the target. The man's face showed either incomprehension or fear. Leshtea began to breathe heavily and fell to the ground. The recoil from the shot had hit her because Turin had pointed the muzzle upward. Cardiff himself was nervous, because the girl could have gotten right into the detective. But apparently that's what she wanted. The protagonist rose to her feet and pointed out that her interlocutor was sweating. Was that cold sweat? Her hand reached for his cheek, but the man wouldn't let her touch him. He'd been lying to her all along. Turin had shown concern after all, even if he denied it. Was he really afraid the girl would become a murderer? If it wasn't, he should have proved it. If he did, the money in the prince's ring would be his. There was just one more bullet left in there. Turin pulled away abruptly and ordered him to stop this nonsense. The man who killed the wolf was so enraged. All we could do was wait for him to pull the trigger. But his hands were trembling and still he pulled. The girl lied about the bullet. She did it out of boredom. She wanted to see his face contorted with a grimace of regret after making a mistake. Just like now. Leshtea was sure he loved her. The man grabbed her hand and pulled her right onto the bed. He sank his lips into her, giving her no chance to resist. The man covered her plump lips, preventing her from taking a breath. His hot breath burned her skin. The protagonist managed to get out and stop Turin, except he was against it. He had a sinister expression on his face that said it would be in Leshthea's best interest not to lash out. Broker squeezed both of her hands, bringing them upward, and began to inspect her body. The pieces of cloth that had been closed were flying around the room, but Turin was enjoying the process. There were bite marks on her chest that looked like a mark. The girl was twisting in different directions trying to break free. She asked Terran to let go of her hands and promised she wouldn't run away. Her phrase alone made him stop. His eyes savored the sight of her chiseled figure, and his face reflected a smug smirk. The boy flashed a smile and did as she asked. He squeezed her hands so hard that they left red marks. Laishtea shook, either from pleasure or from the pain in her wrists. Terran gave her time to rest while he himself was suddenly unclothed. The man led the proceedings and listened more to what the woman was saying as he abruptly took possession of her body. The slight jolt brought pleasure. Laishtea denied it despite her own reaction. Broker, however, took her by the waist and lifted her into his arms, touching her with his gaze. Her small hands clung to the man's broad back, and her eyes closed automatically. Laishtea begged to let her go, but Terran was moving toward the wall to shackle her more tightly. During the process, she returned to studying his body in every way possible, until suddenly she saw in the mirror how his huge body was covering her. Against the background of his muscles, the girl seemed small and fragile. Broker noticed where she was staring and sneered that she liked to watch it after all. He had no choice but to walk to the back of the room and dump her on the bed. In her head, Laishtea was already devising a plan to keep Terran from intimidating her. When he approached her, she asked what was in his future plans. The man turned her around, doing something embarrassing, watching for a reaction. Now they could both enjoy the view in the mirror. Only the broker held everything in his hands. He wished Laishtea would take a good look at everything. He liked to push her, especially when the girl resisted and was embarrassed. Terran promised to finish everything when she opened her eyes, but the protagonist couldn't believe his words. A fire appeared in his eyes, symbolizing excitement and a wild desire to possess. And the game continued to develop. Even now, the protagonist continued to love him as he loved her. It seemed the man himself couldn't deny it. Terran buried his nose in her shoulder, breathing in her scent. Her body shook, and her arms reached out to embrace the girl. Laishtea knew that the truth was behind her. The chirping of birds began to creep into the dark room. A strong hand opened the curtains, letting the sunlight illuminate the space. This caused the protagonist to open her eyes. Into her field of vision came Terran, whose gaze was blank. The thought that the man was heading somewhere made her jump out of bed. As it turned out, the snow had stopped. The phrase that Mr. Cardiff had let go of all formalities since he was going to do the irreparable yesterday afternoon rang in her head. It was an elusive sensation, but Laishtea felt as if an entirely different person stood before her. Terran looked around the courtyard with a calm expression. The words came out of his mouth that it was necessary to borrow a horse from the nearest hotel because winter was coming to an end. The man was going to set off as quickly as possible so as not to catch darkness, and he would be back tomorrow at lunchtime. Laishtea stopped him, explaining that her words still stood. But he pretended that he didn't understand anything, or that he had forgotten everything. This embarrassed the protagonist, but even so she reminded him that she had offered to leave together. A light blush colored her face, which could not be said for Terran. The man was hard as stone. There was only coldness in his heart. He gave a sharp negative answer and turned away, slamming the door. Laishtea was left alone. Alone with her thoughts. Sadness and deceit were reflected in her facial expression. She decided not to linger in bed, so she got up and picked up the rest of her clothes. Instead, the girl accidentally missed the gift from the detective. Laishtea picked it up, inspecting it for any chips, but thankfully it was fine. Something rumbled outside, and it caught her attention. The protagonist pulled on her tattered clothes and saw a dark figure on horseback outside the window. It was obvious to her that one day she would be forced to leave this place, but still, being away from Terran seemed impossible. At least now Laishtea was not going to part with him. While she was left to herself, then it was necessary to mend her dress and practice her culinary arts, which the girl did over the next couple hours. Now that she had nothing else to do, Laishtea flopped down on the bed. She didn't have a map or a book on healing herbs, just this balloon. Knowing who she really was, did the detective give her this item on purpose? Nevertheless, the protagonist could not understand his words about the orb being at rest, because it felt as if Mr. Hofrander didn't care at all whether the snow globe broke or not. And if you think about it, he was trying to say something before Laishtea fell down the stairs. Suddenly the girl came to the frightening thought that the detective could have heard those strange noises too. Third floor. Secret room of the mansion, a distance of 287 steps. And even everything significant in this mansion was located precisely on the third floor. I think Mr. Hofrander was talking about a truth serum that was supposed to be stashed dressed here. The man shared that the width of all floors at both ends of the corridors is the same, exactly 287 paces from the east end to the west end. Is it possible that he meant that there was no hidden room in the corridor? And those words of his about everything of significance and interest being on the third floor, had the detective really discovered something there? It could be the bedroom of an illegal substance dealer, a room with broken mirrors, a closet with rope, or a torture chamber. Hofrander was looking for truth serum, which was used for torture. The mere thought of it was terrifying. The girl began to worry that something strange might have happened to her guest. He had said very clearly then that he would not dare to continue exploring the third floor. Something had definitely happened in the torture room. That was what brought the protagonist to this place. Leishtia armed herself with a gun and began to move inside, worried that the words would hear those sounds. Now was not the time to stop. For some reason she thought it might be some kind of device that opened the entrance to a secret room or turned a wall, so the girl pressed on. Something she was doing wrong. Nothing was working, so Leishtia thought she should have taken all those things off. But even having done that, still nothing could be heard. What if there really wasn't anything here, and the protagonist was wasting her time? She let out a relaxed exhale until something touched her foot, making her fear come over her head. It was the snow globe the detective had given her. Her hand reached for it, and a thought went through her mind that she needed to find a suitable place for it. It was round and rolled very well on the floor, so it didn't work the first time. How did the gift get all the way to the torture room? The distance from the middle of the room to the wall was too great. So for some reason, Leishtia thought she was the one who had accidentally nudged him. The girl looked around the room and thought it would be best if she left the balloon next to the gun. Except that the snow globe rolled again, right back to where Leishtia had just been standing. Okay once, but this gift could not have rolled into the same place twice. Is it possible that the cause was a sloping field? The thought crossed the protagonist's head that aristocrats would never allow such a flaw in their estate, so it was done on purpose. But was it only in this strange room? Leishtia wanted to check it out from the side of the hallway. She placed the snow globe on the carpet because she figured that slope had to be there too. Apparently, the girl was right. The object kept rolling, and one could only guess how far. After a while, the ball slowed down, which meant that the third floor corridor was also sloping from one end to the staircase in the middle. On the first two floors, the snow globe didn't roll, so they're flat. But the third one was different. The presented object rolled from the eastern wall to the center of the mansion, so the floor must have had some elevation. But the ceiling of the room beneath the torture chamber is as high as any other. There must be some space between the second and third floors. If so, there must be some passage in this very room. And that was left to be tested. Leishtia made mayhem with the mace she found. In the secret room, she managed to break through the wall, behind which she found a ladder of light fixtures. This was the secret place. With the naked eye, one could see that there were fresh footprints on the stairs that had not yet accumulated dust. That meant that someone had been here recently. And there was even some kerosene left in the lamp. The protagonist didn't want to believe that this person could be Teren. Her body shuddered at the thought until she heard a strange sound, like someone crawling. Leishtia heard some scrambling, so she assumed it was a large beast. She looked at the dark passageway she had to go through to see for herself. It was so spacious upstairs, so she had no idea how they had managed to hide something like this. The girl climbed up on both feet and came across a bag with unknown contents. Apparently it was the illegal substance the detective was looking for. Suddenly someone behind Leishtia's back called for help. The girl grabbed a lamp and pointed the light at the source of the sound. It was a man whose body was completely covered in blood. To all appearances, he was being tortured. The protagonist lowered herself to him, promising to help, The stranger, however, looked up with dark eyes that were slightly blinded from the light they hadn't seen in a long time. He breathed heavily and suddenly called her name. It was getting even scarier because the man didn't understand how Leishtaya could have escaped her broker. At this time, Taran Kardath himself harnessed a horse. The protagonist came toward him and threw herself into his arms. A slight blush remained on her face, either from the cold or from the kiss. The man interrupted her and added that the sea had already thawed, so she would soon leave the place. And it could be done even today. Leishtaya asked again if Tara wanted to go with her, but he remained silent to her request. The protagonist had packed her bags and was going to leave after lunch. But before that she wanted to eat, because earlier she had made a promise to cook him something. Everything was already ready, so the girl invited the broker into the dining room, though she couldn't vouch for the taste. Leishtaya gifted Mr. Kardath with a smile, which mesmerized him more. In fact, the man agreed that it looked pretty good. She asked him not to jump to conclusions, because she had to try it first, and only then to evaluate. The first dish to try was a tomato soup, based on Taran's recipe. Fortunately, he liked it, which Leishtaya was very happy about. Although he did say that he should have put less vegetables in. The girl admitted that she had put all the leftover food in there, which would make it hard for the next guest to eat. The last phrase made Leishtaya question what the guy was talking about. It was about those who would want to stay here. What did he care about them? He was leaving anyway, after all. Taran bowed his head and calmly replied that he would only go as far as the port of Sylvains, and that he would have to think further. As he took a sip, the protagonist noticed aloud how much he had changed. It was like a completely different person from the first time she'd met him. Now he wondered what he'd been like then. Leishtaya thought he had been strangely rude the first time. The last word made him embarrassed. Was it really so conspicuous? It was unacceptable to her because Taran ignored her attempts to get closer one after another, even when she couldn't sleep because of the strange noises. Though the man remembered that he himself had suggested she come to him then. But Leishtaya couldn't just show up at a complete stranger's room. He thought it was obviously better than running away from the wolves late at night. She didn't agree with his stance because a wolf attack Taran would still save her. But from his attack no one could save her. His yellow eyes, long pupils like those of a predator, watched the protagonist's reaction carefully. He explained that he wouldn't have attacked that night anyway, even though he didn't believe it. When the food was finished, Leishtaya brought a drink. Taran didn't understand what the reason was, so she herself hinted that the man was saving it to drink with her at the very end. Except he thought it was too early for the end because they still had 3 whole days to go. But the protagonist replied with a smile on her face that it was their last dinner. Taran cast an angry glance at her, deciding that the woman had slipped him poison, which she didn't bother to deny. The energy in the room grew darker and the silence deafening. This was no joke. The broker was furious and ostentatiously poured the contents out of his glass, asking his interlocutor what it was all about. She feigned stupidity, probably, so Taran finished the last drops. Leishtaya offered to tell him something interesting, something he would really enjoy, but the broker was unwilling to listen to the woman. His barbed words did not offend the protagonist at all. On the contrary, she was eager to finish what she had started. As Taran had said, there was a ghost in this house. From the start, it was a game that Leishtaya had no chance of winning because this mansion was a man's playing field. She had already lost the moment she crossed its threshold. The broker interrupted her and explained that he had said it only to scare her. He explained that there are no ghosts here, but she knew the truth, and there was a phantom right in front of her. That phrase made the man's gaze grow heavy, as if Leishtaya had unraveled some terrible secret. He lowered his eyes and noticed that the protagonist hadn't even touched the soup. He was thirsty, so it could only be one thing. Suddenly the man jumped on the table, causing his eyes to blur. He clutched his head as if Leishtaya had done something she shouldn't have. It wasn't poison, it was truth serum. Now he had no strength to resist. His heavy body rested on the dining room table. The protagonist asked if her interlocutor was a phantom. After a short pause, the guy thought about the right way to say it. It all started the moment he received this offer. Before the day of the coup d'etat, he was offered to straighten out the son of the leader of Brand's party for a decent sum of money. The man found out his location and was about to get down to business. But after the sudden start of the coup, he was unexpectedly handed a bag of gold coins. It was payment for taking out Guy. The client wanted me to tell you that Taryn did a good job. There were already rumors that Brand had been taken out by a phantom. Others were saying it was the work of a mercenary. Only the man knew the truth. Did someone dare to trespass on the business that fed him? Had the best mercenary missed his prey? Now all that remained was to find out who had done it. Turin thought the man now felt superior and laughed at him. But his hurt ego was nothing compared to the vengeance of the party leader for his son. He wouldn't let the man live so easily after taking over, so it was even in his plans to leave the country. But the broker came to him with a new offer. It bore the seal of the leader. He knew exactly who had killed his son, but he decided to have Turin do it anyway. The name on the letter was Leishtea, Herendo del Armen. Leishtea was the youngest daughter of the fallen Count Armen, who had lost absolutely everything because of the revolution. The man believed that she was now just a fugitive noblewoman with no influence or power. Then why was he asked to kill her? Was it really some kind of trap, even if the party leader is a madman? Did he choose Turin solely because of his skills? Or was it still because of his son's death? Maybe he had sent a mercenary, or a soldier to take revenge on the boy. But those were just guesses. Turin wouldn't know if they were true or not if he hadn't seen it for himself. He was tempted to take this order purely out of curiosity. After figuring out an escape route, the man attacked Turin Cardath. Somewhere he became him, a broker in exile, and began to wait for her. But the bastard wouldn't tell him a word, so he had to go to all extremes, even torture, to find out anything about Leishtea. The man had found a secret space in the mansion where he could shut down the real Taryn, and that truth serum she had given him was there too. A little later, the protagonist herself came to him. And he then, as he himself admitted, was very surprised. She managed to escape quite easily. In his head, he was telling her that even if the girl hid all the strands of her hair under the shawl, it wouldn't be so easy to forget her face. Those expressive violet eyes were beautiful and unique, like the sky in the early morning. Even with such a wary gaze, she was so beautiful that it was impossible to look away. He thought his new acquaintance would be even cooler if she smiled. On how oft they'd met in any other situation, the man would have dragged her in for some privacy without a second thought. But now he had to play the role of the kind broker, which was a shame. He experienced unprecedented pleasure every time Leishtea called him Turin and spoke to him politely. It was as if they were acting out a play, but the protagonist was becoming more and more sensitive and fearful. The sounds of the real Turin's torture in the night seemed to reach her, so he decided to stop prying information out of him. It distressed him that the former light was gone from her face, so he had to get close to her and find out why the party leader had dragged him into this. The guy needed to get to know Leishtea better to get any leads, which is why he was inviting her over. If there was something between them, he would have gone for more, but the protagonist rejected him, making the fandom feel like his decisions were too hasty. She wasn't willing to give up so easily. Even being ruined, an aristocrat was still an aristocrat, so time was getting short. The next night, when the phantom went to fetch water, Leishtea was crying and mumbling something in her sleep. Her attempts to call out to Taryn were an excuse not to wake the girl. He thought that in such a situation, even Lady Armen herself would come to him. Except his expectations were wrong. Instead, Leishtea simply ran away, leaving him behind. Phantom felt undeservedly abandoned. For all this time, he had thought he had treated her well enough. There had to be something else. The party leader couldn't just pick her as his victim. Could it be that they had set a trap for him? In pursuit of a clue, the Phantom went after the protagonist, but found her almost killed by a single wolf. Carrying her unconscious body, he kept wondering why she hadn't come to his room. Should he have been more attentive and affectionate? While he was wandering in his own thoughts, her body became so cold that the man had to warm it in the cave. It was rewarding because Leishtea trusted him. Then Leishtea told her that she had straightened out those who dared to approach her. It was simply impossible to hold back the laughter at that moment. The puzzle was finally coming together. She was the one who had killed Bran. The leader of the Revolutionary Party knew this, which is why he asked the Phantom to kill her, giving her a chance to avenge her first failure and the enemy of her child. On the other hand, she was so innocent, worried about someone finding out her secret. Alishtia suffered from nightmares. Either way, the Phantom had finally learned the truth she craved, but there was no reason to keep her alive any longer. Except that the man wanted to keep her alive, at least for a little while. He had 3 more weeks to complete the order, and he was going to treat her with the utmost care before that time expired. He wanted to make sure she didn't have any more nightmares. It was amazing how far the Phantom was willing to go to save someone. It was as if he had become a completely different person. Later, word came of an invasion of bandits, and his heart sank into his heels with fear that they might harm her. Fortunately, he was able to deal with them before any serious incident occurred. He didn't want to soil her, but Alishtia had thrown herself into his arms so suddenly. Her face, smeared with blood, looked so pitiful and cute at the same time. At that time, a strange thought crossed his mind. If the protagonist knew about his plans, she would never hug him like that, and he didn't like it. It was only then that things became clearer. Alishtia was hugging at the Phantom in Terran Cardath. What was he to do? Should he have revealed his true identity? Was it worth keeping her alive and taking her with him? But his hands were up to his elbows in blood. The once clean hallway had turned into a bloody field. He didn't want to drag her into this life. Saving her and making her the mercenary's lover would not be an act of altruism. It would be an act of selfishness. What would the look on her face be if she knew of his identity? Clearly not as sweet and smiling. So while Alishtia was still alive, he wanted to lavish her with his kindness and attention, for after her death he would not be able to do anything for her. But he wasn't the only one with a problem. Her kindness wasn't directed at the Phantom, but at the Terran Cardath he was pretending to be, so it was decided to deliberately make embarrassing comments and even kiss her. He did what he wished, believing that Alishtia wanted exactly what he wanted. She said she loved him. In that dream, the girl said it more than once. But it was just a dream. If they became partners, their lives would only become more complicated and confusing, because sincerity was the last thing they needed. Yet he was intoxicated by their embrace. The Phantom even began to daydream about what might happen. Would they be able to live together? If he stopped being Phantom, he was going to stop with the bloody orders and start a life of love with her. Except that Alishtia had personally angered the leader of the revolutionary movement, which meant it was obvious that he wouldn't stop hiring people until she was gone. He thought it would be best for her to end this pathetic semblance of life now. His gaze went blank. They really shouldn't have dreamed of love, but having found that troubled detective, the Phantom couldn't do that to him because of her. It was unthinkable. It seemed to him that Alishtia was already on his leash, but it wasn't like that at all. He decided to draw a clear boundary so that she would no longer be able to interfere with his plans. But the protagonist said she loved him so much that she was willing to give up all the benefits. She needed him no matter what kind of person he was. Except the man Alishtia loved didn't exist. It was just an act. She was enchanted by the Phantom. So the Phantom hoped she would fall out of love with him. It would be better that way. He could hurt her, but he didn't want to break her heart, so he pushed her away time after time. Phantom didn't know if it was a show of love or arrogance, but she knew the answer. Hearing those words, the man realized that if he didn't kill her, he'd be saying goodbye to his own life. Maybe it was too late because his brain was telling him to do so, but it wasn't that simple. How ridiculous did her declaration of love sound to him? Alishtia was sincere, and the Phantom was only playing the role of Terran Cardath. He wished for her death. Those words moved her to tears. Her frail body collapsed to the ground, while the man managed to get up. He added that when he pointed the gun at her, he really hoped that there was at least one bullet in it. He felt like this was his last chance. Like the Phantom would go insane if this went on for a couple more days. With those thoughts in mind, he pulled the trigger. His hands were shaking unimaginably. But when no bullet came out of the muzzle, he felt unprecedented joy, and at the same time realized that the Phantom had consumed him. The man would never be able to do it again. The reason was that he loved Alishtia. There wasn't much time left, and he needed to make a decision. Now the Phantom knew he couldn't kill her, so he would put it off, probably for the rest of his life. All the smiles, sweet gestures, and nice words he'd bestowed on her weren't fake, but they weren't sincere either. What was true and what was false? Maybe the Phantom didn't realize it himself. Her heart was in turmoil, because the protagonist felt betrayed. Would the situation become clearer by sifting through their memories together? But which ones are worth preserving? Will these two be able to love each other like this? Leishtea gave a clear answer. She was going to forget everything that had happened between them, as if the Phantom had never been in her life, and it would be gone forever. The man had one request. He was so thirsty that he was ready to go crazy. The girl saw his condition, so she thought that in such a state it would be difficult for the guy to overpower her. This closeness made her heart beat more frequently, so she still needed time. She brought the wine and asked the man to keep his head cocked. Leishtea looked into his eyes, noticing that the effects of the truth serum had worn off. The Phantom grabbed her hand, dropping the glass, and kissed it. But it didn't work. The man asked her not to forget about him. It was a Phantom curse. It was rumored in high society that Countess Spencer had decided to adopt her niece, namely a fallen noblewoman. The girl was to be the bride of a member of the ruling dynasty. People whispered that the Countess was doing it to get herself an immodest dowry, because the prince's bride certainly had a lot of riches. Lady Spencer even negotiated with the cousin of some lady's husband. The maid read a letter that said that someone was giving this precious piece of jewelry to Lady Spencer. It was a gift from the Baron. The girl with long red hair didn't even listen to her. She didn't care about gifts from the Duke, even if he owned 4 gold mines. It was him that Leishtea had seen yesterday. The servant pointed to the box and necklace, but the lady asked her to stop. She was bored with the sight of it all, so she asked to be out of sight. A heavy exhale escaped her lips until suddenly someone's scream roused everyone in the room. A middle-aged woman with the same color hair ran in. She was worried about Leishtea's loss of appetite and wished to know when it had started. The protagonist stood up and explained that it had lasted since the day her parents died at the hands of the revolution. For this reason, the woman protested about getting married. Moreover, she even made the assumption that Leishtea was pregnant. Words of rebuttal were heard. The girl also added that her belly was not even growing. No pregnancy was out of the question because she was much skinnier now than when she was in the mansion. Leishtea thought she might be carrying his child, but it had been about 6 months since she had left this place. She couldn't even believe it. Lady Spencer countered that the Duke of Noxer wished to marry her. So if her pregnancy was revealed, something terrible would happen. Suddenly the Duke would call for a physician. The protagonist remained calm, and therefore would not be afraid to just leave and live alone, except that the Countess did not wish to listen to her anymore, as she was already part of her family. Leishtea now bore the surname Spencer. She should have behaved like a proper lady. But she knew what her new stepmother was talking about. The woman wished to increase her dowry at her expense. Her hand reached for the pendant around her neck. At the social party, everyone asked about it, to which she said it was her mother's family heirloom. Everyone believed the story so easily. After the illegal entry into the port, she managed to restore her status, but those times never left her mind. The man with the headband had nervously explained to her that day that Leishtea had to find her own ticket. She needed to search other people's bags where the brass token should have been. The girl should have just handed it over when she boarded the ship. She had succeeded. She ended up with 2 tokens in her hands, but when the protagonist provided them, she was asked where the other passenger was. Luckily, she wasn't scared and asked for one back. Leishtea didn't even want to know why he had 2 tokens, because the man just might have been a very considerate person. However, he didn't seem to care much about the missing tokens. Preparations for sailing began, but she was still immersed in her thoughts. Terran had planned everything. He didn't even answer the heroine's question whether he would go with her or not. Thinking about it, Leishtea all realized that the man was ready to go on the road with her. This made it hard on the soul. On the other side, she was met by the Countess, who embraced her like her own daughter. She had been through so much. Her aunt noticed how the girl had lost weight, so she asked her to take care of herself and find a winning party. And then Leishtea realized that in this place she would be seen as a passive income. She is here to enrich the Spencer family. While at the social event, she was approached time and again by young men. Even though she had to live in the snowy wilderness all this time, it was very easy to get used to these luxurious conditions. But nothing made her smile sincerely, neither gifts nor flattery. These men knew nothing. They had no idea how quickly a shot person dies, how weak the government was, how big and vicious the wolf was in the wild, how hard it was for two people to survive in a mansion during a snowstorm. Lady Spencer felt devastated and alone. Moreover, the leader of the revolutionary movement was still alive, so she needed to be on guard. The protagonist had miraculously managed to escape the assassin he had sent, but no one could guarantee that he wouldn't want to send another one. Now Leishtea felt that she would have to spend her entire life in fear. Even the dream in which someone was promised a generous price for her life was repeated time after time. She heard the voice of the leader, whose face she had never seen, in the next room. The protagonist herself stood in the doorway with a revolver in her hand, trembling. Suddenly someone's footsteps were heard, which caused Leishtea to jump up from the bed and decided that it was a phantom that had come to kill her again. If that was the case, she wished she could hug it as tightly as possible. She begged that it would turn out to be him. The men were out hunting. Having visited a place where there was quite a bit of game, Leishtea rode past them seated on a horse. Here they, in turn, had a bet. Whoever would be the first to catch the prey would win. The protagonist, however, caught the angry look of the Countess, who was apparently displeased that she was spending her time here instead of being treated. Her aunt only saw her as an asset that she could sell to the Duke of Noxar. Leishtea, on the other hand, hoped that shooting would help her get rid of that oppressive feeling, just like back in the day. She felt much freer here than at the stifling parties. Suddenly Lady Spencer was called by a man who noticed that she often came to hunt, so he offered to teach her to shoot. But Leishtea refused because she knew how to do it herself, even though no one had ever seen it once. They even grouped together to find her a weapon. The heroine confidently assumed the pose, remembering Taryn's clues, and a shot rang out. She shot into the sky, which is why everyone thought her arm had popped off. While the others were trying to figure out if she was okay, Leishtea abruptly turned around and ran away. She was still thinking about him, and it was driving her crazy. A moment ago, the heroine had felt so free, but now it was like she was suffocating. Her chest was heaving with memories of the warmth of his body. By evening, it was known that the leader of the party was dead. It was told by the Countess. Moreover, this information was written in all the newspapers. The leader of the revolutionary movement was found dead in his home. The cause of death was suicide. A pistol was also found next to him. What was going on? Had this man died a year earlier, there would have been no revolution. The newspaper also said, but a suicide note was left behind, followed by traces of self-harm. Leishtea felt that there was something wrong here. There was no way he had killed himself. The man was a devious man who hired the best assassin to avenge his son. He had successfully led a revolutionary movement and seized power. Could this monster just leave a suicide note and commit suicide while his son's main enemy was still alive? All of these factors seemed strange, but if he did it, everything would fall into place. Taryn had taken his life, ignoring the protagonist's request not to kill anyone else. But what was the reason? His tall figure languidly watched the falling flakes and snow as the girl ran towards him, naked and frozen. She called out to the phantom to whose left she could not make out. The nightmare had ended because of the sudden appearance of the beast. Once again, the sheets were damp. Winter came, and with it, the return of the menstrual cycle. Auntie was simply delighted and immediately called the healer, who congratulated Lady Spencer on the fact that she could now marry successfully. This was such a relief to the Countess, because, as she expressed it, she had been overcome with excitement over her forthcoming engagement. Now she had only to wait, for soon everything was to be accomplished. It won't take more than a month. His lordship wanted to have the nuptials next spring, so they will definitely be engaged by the end of this winter. They were going to a soiree at the Hopkins family's tomorrow, but Leishtea was mesmerized by the picture outside. During the snowfall, the place looked so much like that mansion. She had many obligations thrust upon her, one of which was to find a dress. The Countess colored with happiness because she thought it was a miracle to be engaged to someone like the Duke. Except that this man was 30 years older than the protagonist. This is already his 5th marriage. He already had 3 sons. And that, strangely enough, didn't bother her aunt much. And while Ishtea was enjoying the winter chill through the window, Taran was watching her. He stared at her waving red hair for a while before he turned around, disappearing into the darkness. The next day, the Countess turned to her adopted daughter with the words that it was time to begin preparations. If Ishtea didn't have a mask, she should have told the maids to look for something in the pantry. The point of the dress code was to look aristocratic. But the protagonist mentally called them pathetic. This rule screamed so much about being set by an aristocrat. But Countess Spencer was already engrossed in choosing dresses for her ward. She tossed 2 choices on the bed that looked as modest as possible, except that one could guess from Ishtaea's sigh that this was far from the case. In 3 months on the run, she hadn't seen a single commoner dressed so luxuriously. It didn't matter anyway, because after her engagement to the Duke, she wouldn't have to dress up much. Her aunt irritably asked her to get dressed and go out, but the girl thought it would be better if she wore a dress without any jewelry, even if it wasn't the Countess's choice. And when Ishtea was finally ready, her aunt, on seeing her, was furious, for her dress looked like a nightgown. But even so, she did not agree to change. The wedding was only 2 months away. No wonder the protagonist felt exactly the same as she did during her engagement to Prince Jade. It was just the way it was supposed to be. Engagement and wedding to the man the family had chosen. Married life, children. Ishtea used to take it for granted. Until the revolution came and she met him. They actually lived as a married couple for a while. If the protagonist had continued to live with this man, they would probably never have been engaged. And there would be no point in a wedding ceremony. They wouldn't even have anyone to invite. No complicated procedures, no family approval. Everything would be just the way they wanted it to be. What would her life have been like then? A stranger's voice broke her from her long musings, telling her that they had finally arrived. If Ishtea continued to think about him every winter, it would become a serious problem. There was already a large crowd of people gathered inside. As expected, they didn't know anything at all about the lives of commoners. She wanted to stand quietly in a corner, then rinse off and go home. When she found such a place, it seemed to her for a moment that somewhere off to the side was someone like him. Ishtea had been thinking about him so much that her own eyesight was beginning to fail her. Because Taran simply couldn't be here. But was she really imagining it? She couldn't have heard that voice even in her dreams. There was no way he could be so close. It was definitely impossible. How could Taran be here? The man knelt in front of her and remarked aloud that it had been a long time since they had seen each other. And all she managed to mumble out was that he had gotten it all wrong. He was supposed to look unaristocratic. That was probably the reason everyone was staring at them so much. Even though the protagonist didn't understand why Taran was here, what he wanted to say to her, she was shaking for some reason. She couldn't help but recognize that this outfit suited him very well. So the girl remarked aloud that he looked good, just like a nobleman. They were meeting for the first time in a long time, and Ishtea was already drawing a line between them, and since she was now engaged, it was over between them. He himself knew that the engagement had taken place only a month ago, but he didn't have all the information. It had been a long time since Taran had been in these parts, always a step behind now. Suddenly the guy said that the main character's engagement ring was a little big for her, and it was true. It was just that the Duke had decided to use his previous bride's engagement ring. If he had known she liked old men, he would have come after her in 30 years. Ishtea asked him to stop talking nonsense because she didn't want to get married herself. And that was amusing. He was up to something again. Taran drew her hand to his and suddenly removed the ring. She didn't even have time to get up before the man disappeared around the corner. Why was he acting like a child? He hadn't changed at all since that day. Ishtea wandered around the mansion looking for him until a hand grabbed her waist, pulling her into a dark room. His powerful figure leaned the girl against the wall, and a curious hand reached for her mask while she wondered where her ring had gone. The man was persistent, and so the fall of the mask was accompanied by a heated kiss. But he didn't stop pushing, even when his beloved resisted. It had been so long since she'd experienced these feelings. Saying that it was wrong didn't bother Terran in the slightest. Even though Lashtea said she was engaged, she wasn't wearing a wedding ring. What had happened to the object? He gently took her hand and planted the ring on her finger, but the texture was a little different. They were different. The man explained that he thought this ring would look great on her hand. Lashtea insisted on returning the old piece of jewelry, but Terran played dumb. He gently kissed the back of her hand and asked if she liked it or not. A year later, a hero appeared out of nowhere. Suddenly she had a facial transformation. She wondered if the fake broker was the one who killed the leader. He hadn't been intimidated, had he? He only answered the last question, saying that he hadn't even killed Brand. But then why had he gone for something so dangerous? Terran was not worried, but thought that Lashtea would have nightmares about him again, saying that made her tears come, which she didn't want to show. Their contract had long since expired, and he knew it. There was no need for a contract now, because the protagonist loved him. So what was the big deal? Was Terran really too late? He leaned against her forehead, wrapping his arms around her slim waist. The engagement to the Duke had nothing to do with it. Lashtea only wanted to ask him so many questions that she didn't even know where to begin. Even a year later, she remembered the day of their parting perfectly well. She wondered why the man hadn't answered honestly then. He had, after all, prepared 2 tokens to get as far away as possible. And when Lashtea had asked if Terran would go with her together, he had everything ready to set sail together. But he remained silent. Had he not the least intention of giving her a clear answer? As it turned out, the man was afraid to say that they should have traveled together. It was the truth. He was afraid to accept her as part of his life, afraid to change because of her. And Terran was still afraid that she wouldn't forgive him, that his lies had hurt her. But he came here anyway. Wasn't the guy too shameless? However, Terran realized that if he didn't, he would regret it for the rest of his life. And he wouldn't have known how miserable her life had become after they met. Lashtea had become lonely, had known regret and longing. The days she spent with the man who should have killed her were the happiest of her life. And they were all full of his lies. Then how dare he even dare ask her for forgiveness? It was so hard and painful for the protagonist to forget him. Her heart was torn to shreds. If only she had gotten everything, then she wouldn't have to go through all this horror. Terran asked to be given another chance to atone for his sins. And memories of the Phantom were a nightmare for her, then he would erase them, even though he had left them behind. The guy was the Phantom. At least that's what she thought. Terran now bore a new name, Ian Croce. It was his real one, he hadn't stolen it. The man was even willing to change it if Lashtea didn't like it. A memory of one Ian surfaced in her mind. A boy who had been chased out of his hometown for accidental murder. A man who had long been a murderer, a phantom. A man who had saved her life countless times, while at the same time trying to take her away. He'd asked her to call his name one more time, until a kiss had sealed their bond. Heavy breathing burned her skin, which was covered in a light blush. It was evident in his eyes that Terran had come here ready to give her his love. Eliminated the man who'd made her path thorny, abandoned his false name, and returned to save her from an unwanted marriage. Would Lashtea accept him? So much had happened that her brain seemed to have stopped working, and if she didn't accept him, the man would be gone forever. He wished he could do something she hated one last time. Was Terran really going to kill someone again? Judging by her reaction, he guessed what the protagonist was thinking, and so he explained that everyone would be unharmed. His plan was to steal her, anywhere. The man could take her anywhere right now. For a while Lashtea was silent because he always made offers that were hard for her to refuse. The girl was worried about her aunt who had taken custody of her. And with her disappearance there would be a mess. Was it the kidnapping that was the problem then? A negative answer was heard. Lashtea explained that she still had some packing to do, but the man furrowed his eyebrows, making his gaze seem worried. Usually the protagonist was worried, but she so enjoyed seeing them switch roles. She took his hand, asking him to take his time because she would only need 2 days. That was what the girl had asked for. Terror was embarrassed by her cute reaction, blushing, but still agreed to do as she wanted. Except that if more time passed, he would come and get her. And she wasn't allowed to be told that it wasn't possible. Turin had made all her dreams come true for the past year. She couldn't believe it. She'd never thought he'd propose to her dressed up like an aristocrat. Leishtai had agreed to go with John. Enjoyed each other for a while, until a boy retreated to the door, telling her to come to the third berth at midnight in 2 days. He would wait until dawn in case the protagonist couldn't. There was nothing to worry about. No matter what happened, Leishtai would go with him, and he was glad of that. He abruptly pulled away from the door and gave her a gentle kiss on the forehead before disappearing into the darkness. Only Lady Spencer decided to attract public attention. She bathed in the fountain, pretending to be asleep. The servants rushed to her to help her up, but the girl silently stood up. A few people milled around her and rushed to carry her a change of clothes, while others whispered. Some speculated that she had tripped over her own foot. How drunk do you have to be to fall into a fountain and pass out? What a shame. The Countess was particularly angry, trying to get her newlywed daughter to think that such behavior before the wedding was irresponsible. She was worried about what the Duke might think of her. But Leishtai sat meekly on the bed and listened to her stepmother, promising not to drink again before the wedding. The woman sighed as if she'd gotten her way, but continued to grumble all the same. The main character had seen so many people. She never thought they would be so embarrassed in one evening. Life gave her no respite, and Leishtai should have been preparing for her upcoming wedding. But instead, she'd been laid up all day with a cold. The Countess forbade her to go to the Hopkins family for the evening, as they would ride for her. Lastly, she instructed the protagonist to take her medication and follow bed rest. But sometime later, when the Countess had already returned, she was informed that there was some problem. There was turmoil everywhere because Leishtai had left a suicide note and drowned herself in the winter sea. The woman shuddered at the unknown fate of her niece. She did not understand why Leishtai had thrown herself into the sea. But the man himself did not know the reason, and so showed the note. The Countess snatched it sharply from his hands and began to read. As soon as the protagonist opened her eyes, the moments of the murder of her parents came to mind again. She dreamed of a quiet death at the bottom of the sea, and therefore she was sorry and asked not to look for her. Mrs. Spencer could not believe it, but asked if they had searched the neighborhood. The man ordered an immediate search of the estate and the nearest bodies of water, but the girl was never found. Except that the Countess was only worried about the engagement. She even pretended to faint. At this time, Leishtai waited humbly at the third port, remembering how she had run away while no one was in the manor. The girl packed her things and set up a suicide note, which should have been enough. The tragic suicide of Lady Spencer, that she could not cope with the trauma of the resolution, will absolve the new family of responsibility for the disrupted engagement. Given how many people had seen her that day at the fountain, suicide would cause far less surprise than a mysterious disappearance. It would make it easier to avoid unnecessary searches. She hoped they wouldn't go too far to find whoever had left the suicide note. It seemed to her that she was becoming more and more like him. All that remained was to wait for his arrival, and in a moment he appeared. Leishtai had been waiting for Turin for over a year. Ian took her hand and pulled her to him. But she wondered why he stayed in that outfit, as if they were going to the ball again. As it turned out, the man had done it because Leishtai had told him so yesterday. He even agreed to do what she liked, and the mansion never did that, especially after the protagonist saved Mr. Detective. But no response was heard as the man even turned his head away. Leishtai didn't realize that he could make such a facial expression, but suddenly Ian said that his lover would be surprised when she found out what he had done after her departure. The man returned to the capital and found the detective. The girl flooded him with questions, for she did not think Ian would want to see him himself. So what did it matter after his parting with her? Thanks to the information she had gotten when she first met him, it wasn't that hard to find him. It was a long story that Ian would tell her on the road, which Leishtai would be very happy about, because he has changed for the better this year. That phrase made him curious about what he used to be like, though Ian knew that very well himself. He was always angry when the protagonist ruined his plans, but to him she was far more important than plans. The man asked if there was a place she had that she wanted to visit. Without thinking long, Leishtea gave her answer, suggesting something warmer, and then they decided to go south, which would make for a long journey. Fortunately, she was quite good at adapting to any conditions. Now they could enjoy each other's company without any worries. But suddenly Stea remembered something. She abruptly rushed to her bags in search of something. There was so much she wanted to know about him. Age, date of birth, important memories, former and current likes, life goals, plans for a life with her. She asked him to tell her everything. The protagonist placed her palm on his cheek with tenderness in her eyes, confessing her sympathy. So did he. She had always wanted to hear those words. They held hands and headed into the future,